Any comprehensive history of college football is predestined to miss a lot, I would know. It's hard to draw any kind of straight line through the sport's history that encompasses every major event, every rule change, every overarching trend, every team and every state and every coach, player, and voice that helped make college football what it is today. No region in the United States embodies this ever-present blind spot more than the West Coast, and its golden gateway to the world of college football. The beginning of West Coast football as we know it today began as many good things do, with a future president, a baseball field, and a burgeoning hatred. In 1892, the newly established Cal Golden Bears and Stanford Cardinal agreed to a matchup on San Francisco's Hyde Street grounds, a baseball field built for the ill-fated California League. A maximum of 10,000 attendees were expected to make the trip out to the grounds, and as such, 10,000 tickets were printed. Twice that would end up showing. The unexpected success would throw the entire event into chaos, with its organizers, Cal's Herbert Lang and Stanford's Herbert Hoover, scrambling to find various pieces of kitchenware to hold the unanticipated admission fees. With the whole admission mess settled, the game could finally begin, if it weren't for a whole new mess appearing. Turns out you need a football to play football, and neither Stanford nor Cal thought to bring one. So, out goes sports good proprietor David Golcher on horseback to get a ball. 1 hour later, and the game would finally begin. In this mess of a game, we see a perfect representation of what this early era of college football was for San Francisco and the West Coast as a whole. A chaotic, frantic, and popular mess. Stanford would win this first meeting 14-10 and would remain undefeated until 1898, when Cal won their first game of the series under head coach Garrett Cochran, the man who'd put West Coast football on the map. These are the Carlisle Indians, a program now lost to time, but back in the late 19th century they stood as a considerable force in northeastern football, often going toe-to-toe with the established Ivies in the region. Their head coach was none other than Pop Warner, one of the biggest faces of this prehistoric era of college football. In 1899, he'd be challenged by Cal's Garrett Cochran. He'd take Cochran's challenge, and on Christmas Day, he'd travel out to San Francisco to kick his team's ass. After all, this was a team that handed established powers like Columbia 45-0 losses. How could this West Coast team that just picked up the game a mere few years ago do? To the shock of the Indians, Warner, and maybe Cochran himself, Carlisle would find themselves in a dogfight. The Cal defense would hold Warner's squad, one whose offense averaged 30.8 points per game throughout the season, scoreless. A battle between East and West would end in a safety, with Warner's squad escaping with a 2-0 win. What mattered, though, was Cal made them sweat, made them fight for their 2-0 win. Only two teams would leave the Indian offense scoreless, the national champion Princeton Tigers and California. The West Coast was now just as competitive as the East, and this game proved it. That same year, Cal would defeat Stanford for a second year in a row, an achievement that won their Berkeley campus this statue. Entering the 20th century, this crosstown rivalry will only become more and more heated. So while we're still in this primordial stage, let's talk a bit about the universities themselves. On the surface, Cal Berkeley and the University of Stanford are very similar, both being highly prestigious West Coast academic institutions. What separates the two, and what this football rivalry is built upon, is culture. Stanford was built upon a horse ranch, and in the decades since has never relinquished that rural feeling, becoming a patchwork of eucalyptus trees and Spanish architecture. It's known as the Farm, a quiet, contemplative, and to some, an incredibly boring campus. The University of California at Berkeley is the exact opposite, being closer to San Francisco proper and its sprawling urban environment. There's always something to do, in stark contrast to the quiet, natural ambiance of Stanford. Cal prides itself on noise. Both the hustle and bustle of the city and the culture of activism Berkeley will soon birth. So on the surface, it's another rural-urban split, a split many college rivalries are somewhat built upon, whether it be Georgia Tech, Georgia, Clemson, South Carolina, or even Miami, Nebraska. Yet, what makes Cal Stanford unique is that this rural-urban split isn't actually real. Stanford isn't a farm school, just a school built on a farm, meticulously maintaining the vibes of a natural campus. UC Davis is California's actual premier agricultural school, a university both down the street from and in the same circuit as the urban Cal Berkeley. It's a cultural split in vibes alone. The alumni are cut from similar cloth, yet it's these aesthetic differences between the Bay's most prestigious schools that will help build the West Coast's first football rivalry. Their 1900s matchup will go down in history for two reasons, one good and one tragic. On one hand, it's the first time the term "the big game" was used to describe the rivalry, a name that will stick with the series all the way to the present. On the other hand, the game would bring about one of the worst disasters in American sports history. During the game, some 1,000 spectators watched upon a roof of a local glassworking factory. A monumental load the roof wasn't built to handle. Midway through the game, the roof would give in, sending more than 100 spectators through the building. 23 men and children would pass away, and roughly 100 more would sustain serious injuries. It would become known as the Thanksgiving Day disaster, and to this day it is the deadliest accident to ever befall American sports spectators. The next year, with the horrific events of the previous year in the rear view, one of West Coast football's most hollowed institutions would be born. For the 1900 season, Stanford's coach would be Fielding Yost, hired away from the Kansas Jayhawks after going undefeated in 1899. Yost would have considerable success in Stanford, going 7-2-1 and beating Cal in the wake of the aforementioned disaster. Despite the success, Stanford's administration decided that only Stanford alumni should hold the position as head coach, and Yost would be cast away from California. Fast forward a year, and Stanford is having an off year under new head coach Charles Fickert. It's here where Stanford got an invitation from an old colleague. Fielding Yost ended up in Ann Arbor after his exile, and has constructed what might be the greatest college football team seen to date, boasting an undefeated, unscored-upon season, and has invited Stanford to a postseason game. Stanford would accept already having a history of postseason exhibitions with Michigan's rival Chicago. They tie the game to Pasadena, California's annual Tournament of Roses to help promote the East-West matchup. And like that, the Rose Bowl, college football's first bowl game, was born. Michigan would predictably dominate Stanford 49-0, and would go on to win a whopping 28 games in a row, constructing American football's very first dynasty with Stanford's banished talent. As the early 1900s continued, voices opposed to the continued play of American football grew stronger as its dangers became more visible. Death and serious injury became somewhat regular occurrences, and West Coast schools would begin to separate themselves and their student athletes from the sport altogether. San Francisco would become the epicenter of anti-football sentiment on the West Coast, and following the 1905 season, representatives of Cal and Stanford would meet to, quote-unquote, do away with existing evils within the sport. With this meeting, West Coast football died, and was replaced with the safer sport of rugby, played in the image of Britain's Pacific colonies, namely British Columbia, Australia, and New Zealand. The two would be joined by schools like Nevada, St. Mary's, and later USC, spending the next decade experimenting with the new sport. Experiments that soon come to American football proper, like the forward pass and increased penalization of rough play. The big game would follow the San Francisco schools into their adoption of rugby, with Stanford dominating this era with a 6-3-1 record throughout. Despite the West's attempts, however, the rugby revolution never crossed the Rockies. The pool of teams to play would remain small, with international trips to Canada and Oceania being rare and incredibly expensive. Soon after the West Coast split off from the rest of the nation, sweeping reforms would come to the sport of football, increasing safety, and in turn increasing the desire for many in the West to return to the domestic sport. Just as soon as it died, West Coast football was about to be reborn. Cal would be among the first to cave. The reason for California's defection alongside other West Coast programs came down to three big things. For one, college football had, in their absence, reformed into a safer sport. American football also remained more popular among the masses. And then, most importantly, they did it for patriotism. California would return to the fold in 1915 and would soon after begin hashing out the West Coast's first conference. In December of 1915, the Pacific Coast Conference would be born, with Cal being among the four charter members, the other of which being Washington, Oregon, and Oregon State, at the time Oregon Agricultural. Stanford, on the other hand, would be among the last programs to give up on rugby, having found plenty of success in the new sport and not wanting to give that prestige up. This would create a brief gap between Cal and Stanford's reintroduction of American football that would result in the big game being split in two, with Stanford's big game becoming a rugby match against Santa Clara and Cal's big game becoming a football game against Washington. Eventually, however, external pressure would reach the farm, and Stanford would return to the domestic sport in 1918, officially ending the Bay Area's rugby experiment. They'd promptly join the newly established PCC, bringing its members up to 6, with Washington State joining the previous year. The Cardinal would be welcomed back to the fold by their San Francisco brethren with a 67-0 shelling. Well, kind of. Stanford in 1918, despite reintroducing American football, still did not have a team, making use of the local Student Army Training Corps to fill out their roster. Because of this, Stanford does not recognize this big game, instead choosing to recognize a much more reasonable 14-10 loss the next year as the rivalry's new beginning. In 1916, California got a new head coach by the name of Andy Smith. Smith would begin his tenure with the Golden Bears with the unenviable task of resuscitating a football program that had spent the last 10 years not playing football, a task that had culminated in Cal's first PCC title in 1918. With this title, California was officially back, and now work could begin on creating the West Coast's first dynasty. In 1920, the Bears would kick off their season with the local Olympic Club, with the game already being lauded as the greatest game held in California since the reintroduction of American football. Cal would leave with a 21-0 win, a respectable, decisive win. Then Cal won 88-0. In place of the scheduled Santa Clara Broncos, California would schedule the local Mare Island Marines. The Marines would soon find themselves in a long track meet with Andy Smith's backs as they ran them up and down the field en route to their 13-score victory, one achieved with California's bench warmers filling in halfway through the game. Mare Island had witnessed what this team was capable of, and from here on out, the West Coast juggernaut would refuse to let up. 79-7 against Nevada, 63-0 against Utah, and, to quote the Oakland Tribune, this alleged game against the St. Mary's Gales. Honestly, what's more absurd here? The 127-0 final score, the fact that the Gales only gained 6 total yards the entire game, or that Andy Smith tried to give the Gales multiple attempts to make this game more respectable. After all, there was nothing the Red and Blue Brigade could do. California, on their way to the very first Rose Bowl, would average 60.25 points per game, with only one game that could even be called competitive, an October 30th trip to Oregon State, where they escaped with a 17-7 win. Stanford, naturally, would get destroyed 38-0, and California could bask in their very first perfect regular season, set to face off against fellow Rose Bowl newcomers Ohio State, also coming off an undefeated regular season. Their trip to Pasadena would mirror their regular season. Their speed would overwhelm the Midwestern powerhouse. They'd leave with a 28-0 victory, and recognition as the greatest team in the nation. This was Smith's first wonder team, a collection of teams over a collection of years that dominate both the West Coast and the entire college football landscape for the first half of the 1920s. What's often lost, however, is how amazingly strange this dynasty would actually be. A product of its time so divorced from today's game it almost looks alien to a modern viewer. Meet college football's three-dimensional offense. Cal's rushing attack, while not absurdly elite, would remain a strong option throughout Andy Smith's tenure, with their backs being among the few in the nation to make use of speed over power to more effectively make large gains. California would also make use of one of the nation's first dominant passing attacks in their three-headed offense. In 1920, despite being legalized for around 15 years at that point, the forward pass remained to many a novelty more than anything. A tool meant more for short gains when your rushing backs can't break through the opposing line. Cal would be among the first to explore the true potential of the forward pass, constantly making long passes through dexterous receiving in the strong arms of California's first great field generals. And finally, the element Andy Smith and his teams would become famous for, their kicking game. Smith's strategy to kick and wait for the breaks went as follows. The offense would line up in a short punt formation, set up for what would be called today a pooch or quick punt, regardless of down, to try to maximize the length of the punt and throw the opposing team off guard. The opposing offense would then get the ball deep in their own territory, and the suffocating Cal defense would, hopefully, fumble the ball away from the ill-prepared offense, either scoring then and there or putting their offense in better position to score themselves. It's a strategy many other coaches during this time would try to adopt. Fielding Yost in particular would find use for it during his time in Michigan, but Smith would be among the very few to master it. Through these three avenues of domination, California had birthed college football's first, and perhaps only, elite three-way attack, one that propels Smith's Bears to 4 more consecutive undefeated seasons, 1 more Rose Bowl, 3 more national titles, and 5 straight wins over Stanford. Stanford was having a rough go at it after returning to the sport, constantly playing second fiddle to their nationally renowned crosstown rivals. They needed someone new, a head coach with experience with both building a team to national prominence and, more importantly, beating California. Luckily for Stanford, they'd find the perfect man for both. Pop Warner would eventually leave Carlisle, due to both a reduction in public spending on the school and an ongoing controversy with one of his players, some guy named Jim Thorpe. But anyways, arriving in the Steel City in 1915, he'd immediately go 8-0, thrash his former employers, and win a share of the 1915 national title. Then he'd do it again in 1916. Then again in 1917, this time with a bunch of dentists. As Warner aged, though, the famously idyllic Pittsburgh climate became less and less desirable to the coach. And in early 1922, he'd sign a contract with Stanford to become their next head coach. Just as California became the West's first dynasty, they found Warner and the Stanford Cardinal hot on their trail. Going into the big game, both Stanford and Cal are undefeated, leading their conference under their respective future Hall of Fame coaches. The winner will come away with both a PCC title and a Rose Bowl berth. California comes in as the favorite, and in front of almost 100,000 spectators in Cal's new Memorial Stadium, Stanford will try and rip the West from the Bears' claws. Stanford will have to rely on their loaded backfield, star halfback Murray Cutback and future Hall of Fame fullback Ernie Big Dog Nevers to break a Cal defense that formed a key part of Smith's three-pronged attack. Sure enough, they're accomplishing just that, bringing the game to a 6-6 standstill going into the second half. Yet, Cal's high-powered offense wouldn't let the Cardinal remain in the driver's seat for long, storming back to take a 20-6 lead into the fourth. Then, in the last 10 minutes, Stanford made it 20-13, before driving down the field once more. The tens of thousands in the audience watched with bated breath as the Golden Bear lost its Western mandate. At least 5 would risk arrest to bring alcohol to ease their worry. A man would pass away from a heart attack in the stands. Stanford would tie the game 20-20. In truth, I could not describe the moment better than Jack James of the San Francisco Examiner did the day after it happened. Breath that had been held for what seemed hours, actually but seconds, was exhaled in a gasp of amazement, of relief, of disappointment, of overwhelming joy. When 98,000 persons gasp in chorus, it is a sound to be remembered. The game would end in a tie, yet with Cal already notching a tie earlier in the year against Washington, it might as well have been a Stanford victory. The Cardinal would claim their first PCC title and their first Rose Bowl since the very first one in 1901. Stanford would end up falling in said Rose Bowl by 17 to Notre Dame and their Four Horsemen, the eventual national champions. It mattered little though. This season would be a sign of things to come, a changing of the West Coast guard, and the beginning of one of the greatest coaching rivalries in the history of college football. Or, it would have been. In 1925, following a 6-3 season, Andy Smith would be hospitalized in Philadelphia, coming down with a case of pneumonia. A few weeks later, on January 8, 1926, West Coast football lost one of its founding fathers. Smith would leave no family. Every dime he left behind would be given back to his home in Berkeley. At Memorial Stadium, there's a bench dedicated to Smith, and inscribed upon it are two quotes of his, one of which still sticks with me today. "We do not want men who will lie down bravely to die, but men who will fight valiantly to live." Andy Smith, his teams, and California football as a whole did nothing but valiantly fight to live. And in the years since his passing, they have never stopped. In 1926, Stanford would assume its newfound position upon the top of Western football, with an undefeated regular season and, more importantly, a 41-6 thrashing of their Bay Area rivals, still reeling from the passing of Andy Smith. This win would end up being the third game in a 7-game Stanford undefeated streak, as Cal began to decline in the latter half of the 20s. In the ensuing Rose Bowl, the Cardinal would have their first introduction to the South, meeting the Crimson Tide in Pasadena. Almost mirroring the 1924 big game, Stanford would hold a lead for most of the game before falling prey to late-game heroics to leave with a 7-7 tie. A tie that would eventually result in the 1927 national title being split between the two. It nevertheless meant a recognized national title, for the first time, belonged to Stanford. In 1927, Stanford would beat California, yet in a way no team had ever employed. Late in the fourth, the game is tied 6-6, and Warner needs a play to break the oppressive Cal defense. Power just isn't doing it. He needs to reach into his bag of tricks. Pop Warner's experience in Carlisle, and particularly with Carlisle's ever-undersized roster, would force the coach to improvise, refining and inventing a variety of trick plays that are still in use today. And in 1927's big game, he's ready to unveil a new one. Fullback Biff Hoffman took the snap and seemed to hand it off to his halfback. Except, he didn't. He hid the ball, running around the California line to eventually bring his team a 13-6 lead. Like that, the bootleg play was born, and Stanford would use it to clinch their fourth Rose Bowl appearance, where Warner would take down another one of his former employers in his and Stanford's first Rose Bowl win. San Francisco would reach the Rose Bowl again the next year, with Cal, despite finishing second in the PCC, being invited to Pasadena due to an ongoing feud with the event's organizers in USC. Their opponents would be Georgia Tech, having gone undefeated for the first time since John Heisman walked the Tech sidelines. Despite being heavy underdogs, Cal matched up well with the undefeated Southern Goliath, looking to enter the second half with a scoreless tie before the Yellow Jackets made a fatal mistake. A fumble, scooped up by Cal's All-American center Roy Riegels, set for a scoop and score. Sure enough, Riegels would reach the end zone and score. For Georgia Tech, he had run the wrong way, costing his own team a safety and putting the Jackets up by 2. California would lose the 1929 Rose Bowl by 1. The next season, football would take a backseat to Stanford and Cal's true passions, axe stealing. Meet the Stanford Axe, a prop introduced in 1899 where a group of Stanford students used it to decapitate a Berkeley student in effigy. Later on, it was brought to a Cal-Stanford baseball game, a game Stanford lost, despite the inherent magical properties of the axe. In the commotion following the game, the axe would be stolen by Cal students. What followed was a drawn-out foot chase, as Berkeley's finest were chased, first by Stanford students, then by the cops, where the axe's handle fell off. The handler had to think fast to escape justice, hopping on a ferry bound for Oakland in the arms of an old acquaintance. He got away with it, and the Stanford axe belonged to California. While at Berkeley, it would be hidden, first in a frat house, then in a bank vault, only taken out occasionally during rallies where they'd flaunt their spoils of war. Until 1930, when 21 Stanford students hatched a plot to get their axe back. During Cal's Spring Axe Rally, a group of Berkeley students would ask to take photos with the famed axe, to which the grand custodian of the axe obliged. The trap was sprung. The cameras would blind Horner, and the disguised Stanford 21 would take off with the trophy. Other false Cal students would set off either tear gas or smoke bombs in the crowd, while the axe entered one of 3 cars, all going in opposite directions, never to return to Berkeley. The immortal, or immoral, 21, in a scheme straight out of a Saturday morning cartoon, returned the Stanford axe to its namesake campus, and their football team would hammer the point home later on in the year with a 41-0 loss. The axe would remain in a San Francisco vault for 3 years while the 2 bickering schools figured out what they wanted to do with it, where they eventually decided to use the axe as a trophy to the annual winner of the game. The West Coast's first football rivalry was now adorned with one of the West Coast's first rivalry trophies. Stanford would retain the axe in 1933 following a 7-3 win, the first big game since 1923 without Pop Warner. He'd leave San Francisco following the 1932 season for Temple, for reasons that remain a constant challenge for both of these big programs today. Admission requirements were going up. Now that more of the American population had access to basic education, Stanford, and Cal too, wanted to retain their elite status among the nation's most prestigious colleges, at the cost of more successful football. Warner would see what was ahead and decided he wanted nothing to do with it. Stanford's 1933 win would propel them once more to Pasadena, beginning a 3-year Rose Bowl streak between 1933 and 1936. Their first would be a 7-0 loss to the Columbia Lions. The Ivies did not make themselves Rose Bowl regulars, mostly due to their ongoing dislike of postseason play, but to kick off 1934, the Lions would make an exception. It would end up being the last Rose Bowl, and one of the last bowls entirely the Ivies would attend, the beginning of their slow withdrawal from the world of major college football. Stanford's next Rose Bowl would be a rematch of their 1927 game against Alabama. The Crimson Tide, even in this early era, are already separating themselves from the rest of the South as the region's premier program, a position that will largely remain unchanged going into the modern day. The Tide will make this bowl the most of any program not in either the Big Ten or PCC, and later the Pac. And in their second matchup against Stanford, they demolished the Cardinal on their way to a perfect 10-0 season. For their final Rose Bowl of the 30s, Stanford would finally pull out a win in Pasadena for the first time since 1928, defeating a 12-0 SMU and denying the Mustangs a consensus national title. After this stretch, Stanford would begin to decline, notching their first losing season in more than a decade in 1936, topped off with a shutout loss in the big game, relinquishing the Stanford Axe willingly for the first time. California would pick up where Stanford left off, entering the 37th season with an energy unseen since Andy Smith's Wonder Teams. Cal's Thunder team, led by a future Hall of Fame tandem and fullback Sam Chapman and center Bob Herwig, would trample their competition. Unlike the high-flying Wonder teams of old, the 37 squad would make use of an oppressive ground game to ground their opponents down, working alongside a defense that hold opponents to an average of 3 points a game. No game would demonstrate their dominance better than the big game, where Chapman ran wild throughout, while the California defense would ensure Stanford wouldn't get past the 15-yard line. The big game would punch their ticket to their first Rose Bowl of the 30s, against none other than Alabama. having thus far gone undefeated in Pasadena and looking to continue their streak. They did not, in one of the most lopsided 13-0 victories college football will ever see. Cal's ever-dominant defense held the tide in check, and their backs would control the game start to finish. Even in situations where Alabama looked destined to finally reach the end zone, like right here in the second quarter, in would come a California defender to kill their momentum. The Bears, like in their golden age, stood upon Western football's peak. The Thunder team would have one more run of dominance, being one disappointing loss to USC away from back-to-back Rose Bowls, before fading away. Then, like clockwork, in comes Stanford, back from the depths to lead San Francisco back to Pasadena. It was an odd decade for the Bay in its football, an era of staggered dominance between the Bear and Cardinal, trading spots atop the PCC. Stanford's undefeated 1940 season came down to one big change, the abandoning of Warner's single wing in favor of the T formation, a formation previously relegated to the earliest era of American football. The T formation would experience a revival in the 1930s after passes were allowed anywhere behind the line of scrimmage instead of 5 yards back. The largest proponent of this scheme would be George Papa Bear Halas, the father of the Chicago Bears, and mentor to Stanford's brand new head coach Clark Shaughnessy. Its use is in its versatility, much like the I formation it will later birth, and it's this versatility that will lead Stanford through their greatest season to date, going undefeated in conference play and knocking off 4 ranked teams on their way to the Rose Bowl against newcomer Nebraska, where they convincingly took care of business to complete their first perfect season and a share of the 1940 national title. And soon after, America would go to war. The Second World War would drastically change the college football landscape, with many schools shutting down their programs altogether due to their players going off to war. Stanford would be among them, pausing the big game for the first time, since the First World War. Hidden in this temporary closure and the globe-altering conflict that brought it about, though, was a gradual change in West Coast football. Western football's first rivalry was being reborn. Now, tell me if this sounds familiar. A prestigious public school in the north of a major city, one in the University of California circuit, has a football program who shares a city with their arch rival. Their rival, to the south of them, is an equally prestigious private school, as storied a program as they are pompous. The two also primarily wear blue and red, if that helps switch things up. Down south in the blinding lights of Los Angeles, the big game was born again. In the background of this story, the University of Southern California has arose as a Western power in its own right, reaching the Rose Bowl with about the same frequency the Bay schools had. Yet, in 1943, with Stanford still in a wartime hibernation and Cal on the decline, UCLA would make their grand entrance to West Coast football's elite, making their first trip, down the road to the Rose Bowl, winning the right through beating their crosstown rivals. For years, Western football ran through San Francisco, with brief overtures to the Trojans and Pacific Northwest. In 1943, that all changed. Soon, UCLA and USC will trade Rose Bowls, just as Stanford and Cal had, and together shift the epicenter of Western football down south. The golden age of Golden Gate football was coming to an end. Yet, not without an epilogue. Berkeley's new head coach, Lynn Osbert Waldorf, can be summed up by a single game. Arriving at a hopeless California program reeling from a 2-7 season, and a student-led firing of head coach Frank Hickhorst, Waldorf would win his first of many Cal season openers against the Santa Clara Broncos. The very first play from scrimmage would end in a Bears touchdown, on their way to an eventual 33-7 thrashing. After the game, the fans, the very same who drove Hickhorst out of town, would arrive at Memorial Stadium's northern balcony to cheer on their new coach, pleading for him to make a post-game appearance. Waldorf obliged, appearing on the balcony with team captain Rod Franz to give a short post-game speech to roaring fanfare. It's a tradition he would continue for as long as he paced the Golden Bear sidelines. Lynn Pappy Waldorf just had that effect on people. A calming, caring parental figure that Berkeley and their team could unite around. The rest of the season would mirror their dominant opener, notching only a single loss going into their game with Stanford. The week before the big game, Cal would massacre the Montana Grizzlies 60-14, to which halfback and future Boston Red Sox star Jackie Jensen would apologize during Cal's now regular post-game balcony briefings. "We're sorry the score went so high today, but we don't care how high it goes next week." Despite their attempts, California wouldn't be able to simply run up the score on their crosstown rivals, who despite being in the thralls of a winless season would put up considerable fight to an eventual 20-18 California win. The next year, Waldorf took his boys to the Rose Bowl, the beginning of California's own 3-year Rose Bowl streak. Their first would be against Waldorf's old team, the Northwestern Wildcats, where California would, for lack of a better term, get screwed. The game 7-7 in the second quarter, a defensive battle between two of the nation's best. Northwestern's driving all the way down the field, where, seemingly, Art Murakowski fumbles the ball just before reaching the end zone, with Cal recovering it for a touchback. The refs, insightful as they always are, did not see it like that, and gifted the Cats a touchdown. Jensen would try his best to keep the Bears in the game, eventually bringing his squad a 14-13 lead, where, tragically, he exited the game due to injury. Northwestern would end up pulling ahead and winning 20-14, with their phantom touchdown making all the difference. They'd enter the big game with a perfect record, and they'd dominate their rivals 33-14 to remain perfect going into their second straight Rose Bowl. A rematch of their first Rose Bowl against the Buckeyes, where Ohio State would notch their first win in Pasadena 17-14. California's 1950 season would end up being the least of their 3-year run of dominance, still winning the PCC and making the Rose Bowl, but tying Stanford, a sign the Cardinal were leaving the muck and mire of Western football and were yet again on the road back to contention. They'd face Michigan this time around, the Wolverines' third ever Pasadena excursion, and the first they wouldn't win by 49. The game, like all of Waldorf's Rose Bowls, would be a hard-fought, low-scoring affair. And like all of Waldorf's Rose Bowls, it'd end in a California loss. Waldorf's success, beyond his personal likability, was a strategy he employed regarding roster construction. He'd make use of a rule in place since World War II, one more or less integral to the game today, that allowed for specialized positions. Before, every player had to play offense and defense, and a player couldn't specialize for one specific role. During the war, this rule would be overturned, and substitutions could be made freely throughout the game. In 1953, the NCAA would overturn this rule change, sending roster construction back 2 decades. These restrictions would eventually be lifted again in the mid-60s, but at the time they would directly lead to the regression of Waldorf's California program, eventually leading to his resignation in 1956 in the face of a losing season and ongoing recruiting violations. His last address from the northern balcony, following an improbable upset of Stanford, would be simple. "I love you, and I always will." Like clockwork, Stanford would return to prominence just as California began its backslide, returning to the Rose Bowl in 1952, despite actually losing to Cal, and would subsequently get demolished by an undefeated Illinois. This return to prominence would be brief for the Cardinal, however, backsliding alongside their Berkeley rivals going into the late 50s, where 2 big things happened. For one, Cal made the Rose Bowl again. In a relatively weak PCC, a 7-2 California would make their 8th voyage to Pasadena to take on the Big Ten champions, the Iowa Hawkeyes. They'd be helmed by quarterback Joe Kapp, a future college and Canadian Football Hall of Famer, with one of the most unique throwing mechanics a quarterback will ever have. Despite solid play from Kapp in Pasadena, the Bears would fall, losing their 4th straight Rose Bowl 38-12. The second major event was, well, West Coast football's second death. The Pacific Coast Conference, the backdrop of this entire era of West Coast football, was collapsing under the weight of scandal. For years, the PCC had prided itself on thoroughness and academics. To illustrate this, the PCC was a conference who sanctioned an investigation on itself and produced a report about 25% longer than the Bible. It's the second focus on academics, though, that would bring about its collapse. The conference itself had an unusually strong distaste for athlete compensation, wanting, quote, students playing at athletics, not athletes playing as students. Athlete scholarships were not a thing in the West, and in response, Western coaches would seemingly try to make their own. It began in 1951, with Oregon's program making use of slush funds and fake classes to entice players to play for the Ducks. Then California would find itself in a recruiting scandal. Then in '56, similar claims would be made against Washington. On and on it went, with most every school from Los Angeles to Moscow pointing fingers at one another for cheating the system. This environment would add to the growing resentment the larger schools of California had for the smaller northern schools, who they claimed made more money off of the brands of LA and San Francisco than their own. Soon this hostility would lead to the complete disintegration of the West's first football conference, with the California schools, alongside Washington, leaving to create the Athletic Association of Western Universities, or AAWU, with the rest being left to dry as independents. West Coast football, for the second time in history, burnt to the ground. And, for the second time in history, a phoenix will rise from the ashes. I'll tell you what I think is going to happen. Some of the California institutions, particularly in LA, will have their fling. Tell me your fears, brother. Just sit back and watch the show. It's gonna be good. Self-policing, no rules, super-duper schedules, $500,000 gates, Red Sanders rides again. Good thing we split the treasury before someone proposed a memorial for him. This quote from Oregon State's president during the PCC's collapse would really get to the heart of what the AAWU was. It was San Francisco, LA, and Seattle's plan to bring big-time college football to the West. Having kicked out the small market teams and legalized scholarships, the schedules of what would be referred to as a Big Five were open to schedule major out-of-conference opponents. Gone were the days of Santa Clara and St. Mary's rounding out the schedule. In were the days of marquee matchups with Notre Dame, Texas, and Penn State. The change would have the added effect of hastening LA's takeover of West Coast football, with 1962 beginning a 28-year-long stretch where Los Angeles wouldn't go more than 3 years without a Rose Bowl. San Francisco's finest, on the other hand, fell off the map. Following their '59 Rose Bowl against Iowa, California would go 2-8, and wouldn't notch another winning season until 1968. Stanford would have it just as bad, already being in the middle of a losing season stretch going back to 1957, and notching a winless season 3 years later. Cal and Stanford both would struggle with the Reformed Conference's tougher schedules, often finding themselves mere cannon fodder for college football's biggest brands. The Big Five wouldn't remain at 5 for long. As the Golden Gates programs languished, the cast-off programs deemed too unprofitable to play with the big teams ended up proving their worth on the field, with the Oregon schools in particular exceeding expectations. That being said, the first to eventually rejoin the fold would be Washington State, reuniting with their crosstown rivals in 1962. By '64, the Oregon schools would also return. The Pacific Athletic Conference, or PAC-8, was born. By the end of this strange experiment, the only PCC member not to be reinvited would be the Idaho Vandals, who would eventually drop down to Division II. To begin this new era of Western football and to get the Bears and Cardinal out of the gutter, both programs would hire new head coaches at the beginning of the '60s. Stanford would, ironically, choose to employ a member of Cal's 3-time Rose Bowl squad, offensive specialist John Ralston, and California would hire another one of their alumni, defensive specialist Ray Wilsey. Both would initially struggle to get their respective programs back to contention, with the '60s as a whole being a decade of rebuilding for San Francisco. Not to say they couldn't have a little bit of fun in the process. In 1959, in the middle of the PCC's death and later reconfiguration, a banner flew for around 40 minutes over Berkeley's campus. The culprit's obvious, and their job far from done. This is the Leaning Tower of Pisa, one of Italy's most recognizable monuments and one a disguised band of college students ascended in October of 1960, carrying suitcases. At the top, they began unraveling the contents of the suitcase, assuring guards they were just measuring the structure. They were not. Throughout much of the 60s, Stanford students would make it their duty to travel the world and bring the big game with them. Their rivalry, the ultimate manifestation of the presence of Stanford. After Italy, there was Kenya, with a banner being hung at the former University College of East Africa. Then came Ecuador, who were not only treated with a banner, but a groundbreaking historical discovery. Then afterwards, in the middle of the Vietnam War, in came Stanford, off the coast to remind all sides who the true enemy was. Speaking of communism, here's Red Square, the center of the USSR and the Warsaw Pact. And here's Stanford. Lest you think the Cold War's neutral states were safe, here's the Cardinal in Vienna, the first time the Austrian government permitted the use of horses for a gag picture, apparently. Then came London, and to leave no stone unturned, a Stanford biology expedition to the Pacific island of Tikopia and make contact with the native population and win their support in the big game. The series of international escapades would be documented in a 1966 edition of the Stanford Daily, sandwiched between the axe story we went over earlier and an ongoing plot to steal California's mascot. It's these three stories, I believe, that paint the most accurate picture of what the culture of this rivalry is. As discussed, these two programs are very similar, and with both having an ever-increasing out-of-state and out-of-country student body, the general loathing many interstate rivalries have taken a more light-hearted tone in the Bay. There's no tree poisoning and murder over the big game, mostly just these elaborate gags thought up by some of the nation's smartest college football fans. In the middle of Stanford's world-spanning quest to hang as many banners as possible, Berkeley burned with the flames of rebellion. The Berkeley protests of the 1960s were a defining moment, not just for California, but for Berkeley itself. While the city itself was no stranger to protest, these would be some of the most nationally visible, as the Bay City moved towards the center of America's counterculture movement. Civil rights activists, free speech absolutists, anti-war protesters, stoners, they all coalesced here, campaigning and fighting for their beliefs under threat of beatings, gassings, and arrest. The chaos would spill onto Cal's campus as well, spreading further to their team, with their head coach reportedly being exposed to tear gas on a number of occasions. Now, the Berkeley protests escaped the limits of this already incredibly long video, and others can undoubtedly cover it better. But I bring it up to illustrate a core tenet of Berkeley's culture, one that'll continue to the modern day. A culture of noise, of protest, and of action. By the end of the 60s, the vision of California and Stanford's head coaches would take form. First was the Bears and their bare minimum defense. By far their best defensive unit since 1937, Cal's domineering defense, led by future Hall of Fame lineman Ed White, would hold opposing offenses to 10.7 points per game, good for 7th best in the nation, and to this day holds a program record for opponents' average gains per play, holding them to just 3.6. Highlights going into the big game would include a 21-7 opening defeat of the Michigan Wolverines in Ann Arbor, double-digit wins over Oregon and UCLA, and a 43-0 walloping of an at-the-time top 10 Syracuse. So far, only USC and their completely uncontroversial star running back O.J. Simpson would crack Wilsey's juggernaut of a defense. That is, until California got a taste of what their former linebacker was doing at Stanford. That year, Stanford had a new quarterback. Practically built for John Ralston's early pro-style offense, he would help usher in an entirely new era of football, a prophet of the West Coast offense. He was Stanford's Jim Plunkett, and in 1968 his potential was just beginning to shine through. 16th in completions, 8th in yards per attempt, and 14th in passing touchdowns, Plunkett in his very first year as a starter has already established himself as one of the nation's best men under center. A fact California's bare minimum defense will come to find out. Plunkett in his first big game would absolutely cook the Bears through the air. averaging around 14 yards per completion and a respectable 53% completion percentage throughout. The Cardinal defense would similarly dominate throughout, shutting down their relatively weak offense en route to a 20-0 blowout. The Jim Plunkett era of California football had just begun. Plunkett and his team would only improve as the 60s came to a close, culminating in his 1970 season. Top 10 or close to it in most every passing stat, breaking the Pac-8 single-season passing yard and passing touchdown records 2 years in a row, leading his team to top 10 wins over Arkansas and USC on their way to San Francisco's first Rose Bowl since the 50s, and winning a Heisman in the process. There was just one small blemish: a 14-22 loss at Berkeley. Stanford's Pasadena opponent would be a Rose Bowl regular, the Ohio State Buckeyes. Ranked number 2 in the nation and with top-ranked Texas losing in the Cotton Bowl earlier that day, if they beat Stanford, a national title will go home with them to Columbus. Going into this game a 10-point favorite, there's no reason to suspect they won't. No reason except for Plunkett. And sure enough, thanks to a fourth-quarter surge, Plunkett would give the Cardinal their first win in Pasadena since 1941. Plunkett would leave San Francisco that year for the pros, a path that, funnily enough, eventually led him right back to the Bay, first with the Niners, then with the Raiders. Shockingly, Stanford would continue on like he never left, with Plunkett's backup Don Bruns picking up right where he left off. The Cardinal would yet again go 8-3, yet again win the Pac-8, and yet again punch a ticket to the Rose Bowl, going back-to-back for the first time since the 30s. This time, however, they wouldn't let Cal steal another upset, decisively beating them at home 14-0. They would enter Pasadena yet again as heavy underdogs to their Midwestern opponents, the ever-familiar Michigan Wolverines. They would, yet again, go toe-to-toe with the Big Ten's finest, and their starting quarterback would, yet again, have a massive fourth-quarter surge to steal the game away. For the first time since Pop Warner, Stanford won back-to-back in Pasadena, and firmly stood upon West Coast football's elite. For a time anyway, before falling back down to earth in 72. The rest of the 70s would end up being fairly quiet across the Bay, with Stanford and California remaining middle-of-the-road programs for most of the decade, with two big exceptions. In 1975, California would win a conference title for the first time since the 50s. Kind of. Helmed by quarterback Joe Roth and future Pro Bowler Chuck Muncie in the backfield, the Golden Bears' balanced attack would rank among the nation's best scoring offenses and averaged helped by their 48-15 domination of Stanford. This team, however, would not make the Rose Bowl. They split the Pac-8 title with UCLA, who they lost to earlier in the year. The Bruins would end up getting the honor instead, going on to upset a top-ranked Ohio State. Stanford, immediately after, would have back-to-back seasons where they'd finished ranked, making their first two non-Rose Bowls. First the Sun Bowl against LSU, and then the now-defunct Blue Bonnet Bowl against Georgia, winning both. Their coach during these 2 years would be some guy named Bill Walsh, with Stanford being his first head coaching gig. After his successful 2 seasons, he'd be hired away by the local San Francisco 49ers, where he'd remain, more or less, permanently. Just as Walsh left for greener pastures, another household name would enter the farm. John Elway, like Plunkett before him, was a superstar in the making, personifications of their sport's rapidly evolving passing game. Yet while Plunkett found Rose Bowl winning success in the Bay, Elway's college career was much less successful, through no fault of his own. The Stanford Cardinal of the early 80s were such a unique flavor of bad team. A top 10 offense led by a Heisman quality quarterback, and a defense that consistently ranked among the nation's worst. Elway would try his hardest to carry his team to victory, like in this 1981 game against a top 5 Ohio State, just to watch the rest of the team snag defeat from the jaws of victory. Going into his last season in 1982, a conference title is off the table. So's a Rose Bowl. But a Heisman, the greatest honor an individual player can strive for, is not. Going into the big game, Stanford and their quarterback need to pull out a win to secure Stanford a bowl invite, keeping Elway at the forefront of Heisman voting. Meanwhile, a familiar face paced the California sidelines. Joe Kapp, in the years between his playing and coaching stints in Berkeley, played in both the Canadian and National Football League, winning a Grey Cup in British Columbia before heading south to Minnesota to lead the Vikings to their very first Super Bowl, becoming the only quarterback to date to ever play in the Rose Bowl, Grey Cup, and Super Bowl. In 1982, 12 years after his playing days, he took on his very first coaching job with his alma mater. The most important tenet of Berkeley's new regime: nothing is earned without sacrifice. A point driven home by Kapp's promise to abstain from his favorite liquor until the Bears won another Rose Bowl. Going into the big game with a 6-4 record, Kapp and his boys seemed set on knocking off Stanford and their Heisman hopeful. The game would begin with a standstill, yet in the second, Cal's Gail Gilbert would let it fly, notching the game's first touchdown. Soon after, a field goal would bring the Bears up 10 going into the second half. Stanford still scoreless. Eventually, however, the nation's Heisman favorite came back to life, bringing the squad back from a 10-point deficit to a 4-point lead going into the fourth. And despite a late touchdown, a failed 2-point conversion would put Stanford in prime position to ice the game late with a field goal. The Cardinal would end up doing just that, going up 20-19 with 4 seconds left on the clock. The game's all but won. All that's left is to kick it back to the Bears and foil a last-second desperation play. Fielded at their own 45, the Cal Golden Bears would create something beautiful. Kevin Moen would receive the ball, and as he found himself in front of a Stanford wall, he lateraled the ball back to Richard Rogers, who then tossed it back to Dwight Gardner, who was promptly swallowed up. It's here where Stanford's band would enter the field, believing the game to be over. It was not. Just before going down, Gardner would lateral it back to Rogers, who, after crossing into Stanford territory, tossed it to Marriott Ford, sprinting further and further into Stanford territory before being stopped around the 23, blindly tossing it back to Moen. At around the 25, Moen would charge his way into the end zone, the only defender in his way being a Stanford trombone player. Through one of the most inexplicable, possibly illegal miracles to grace American football, Stanford had lost. John Elway left for the pros after this play and would end up winning a lot. He'll win 2 Super Bowls, win MVP honors, appear in 9 separate Pro Bowls, and win a place among football's greatest. All that being said, this play in this game would ensure Heisman wouldn't appear among his long list of accolades, with the honor instead going to Georgia's Herschel Walker. Elway would remain bitter regarding the play for years after, yet eventually even he would admit it was just funny. The gags ensued. Even in heart-wrenching defeat, Stanford found ways to mess with their rivals, printing numerous fake issues of Cal's student newspaper claiming the NCAA stepped in and reversed the play. I mean, there was reason to believe it. Gardner sure looked down during the second lateral, and the fifth lateral sure looked like a forward pass. They didn't. The NCAA in the 80s was too busy handing out recruiting violations to overturn the game. To this day, the actual legality of the play is contested though, especially in the Bay. That being said, in the eyes of the official record books, bowl organizers, and Heisman voters, California won. The 80s would end up being a fairly disappointing decade for the Bay Area in football. Well, college football at least. Stanford would be one generational talent away from bottoming out, and with Elway gone, the Cardinal would sink all the way down to 1-10. It's here, I reckon, they had an epiphany. If Elway kept the program respectable before, why not bring in another? Jack Elway, John Elway's father, would be hired in 1982 to try to reverse their fortunes, which he largely did with a respectable 5-6 season his first year in the Bay, keeping the program somewhat above water for most of the decade. In Berkeley, Kapp would remain tequila-less, with his Bears remaining at or below the 500 mark for the rest of his coaching tenure. He'd be let go in 1986, yet not without spectacle. His Bears would lose 14-50 at Washington, and in the ensuing press conference with the Seattle media in response to a question regarding his job security, he'd promptly unzip his pants and ask if the room wanted to see his manhood. It ended up being the Cal administration's last straw, allowing Cap to finish the season but all but firing him then and there. He'd leave with a losing season, yet not without one last improbable win. Stanford in 1986 is having its best season to date, securing both a winning season and a bowl berth going into the big game, where they look poised to demolish a hopeless California and their disgraced head coach. Cal would win 17-11. Cap would be carried off the field by his players, and the crowd would cheer his name. Despite it all, Berkeley still loved Joe Cap. It was just hard not to. The 80s would end up being another decade where neither Stanford nor Cal would make another Rose Bowl, and both would combine for a total of 3 winning seasons throughout the entire 10 years. By far the worst stretch of football both of these programs would experience thus far. Luckily for them, however, this malice would not last into the 90s. Late until the 1990 big game, the heavily favored California holds a 1-point lead over their rivals. And following a late touchdown pass from Jason Columbus to receiver Ed McCaffrey, the Cardinals are looking to win the game with a 2-point conversion.
To the left side, reverses it right. Here it is, Columbus rolling out to his right. Looks into the end zone, throws to McCaffrey, intercepted! It's broken up!
The Bear crowd would storm the field, believing the game to already be won, despite there still being seconds left on the clock, causing both a lengthy delay and a Cal penalty on the ensuing kickoff. The Cardinal would go for an onside kick, and after trading hands countless times, snagged a chance at a miracle on the California 37. And then, with 5 seconds left on the clock, John Hopkins booted it in. The quote, revenge of the play was realized, and Stanford left Berkeley stunned, just as they left Stanford 8 years prior. And then, the year after 1991, Stanford and California made their grand return to national prominence. In their best season since Waldorf, the Golden Bears would make use of one of the best balanced offenses in the game, headlined by eventual Pac-10 Offensive Player of the Year Mike Pawlowski under center, All-American running back Russell White, all coached by the reigning Pac-10 Coach of the Year Bruce Snyder. They'd begin the season with the Pacific Tigers, where they'd promptly rack up a score that fit right into the final scores of the old Wonder teams, going on to clear all but one of their opponents, the eventual national champion Huskies, on their way to the big game. Or they met a Stanford on a similar trajectory, rebounding from a 1-3 start to meet Cal 7-3 and ranked 21st in the nation. Didn't matter to Cal, with receiver Brian Treggs confident enough in the Bears to make a vow before the game to not just beat, but embarrass the Cardinal. They did not. In fact, they did the opposite. Through career-defining performances from Steve Stenstrom and Chris Walsh, Stanford would handle a top 10 Cal comfortably at home, sending the Bears off with their tails tucked between their legs. They'd end up taking their frustrations out in the Citrus Bowl, dominating the Clemson Tigers 37-13. After this miraculous season for both programs, their coaches would get poached, Cal by conference-mate Arizona State, and Stanford by the Minnesota Vikings. In this coaching shakeup, California would decline, and Stanford would somehow get better, with the help of a familiar face. Bill Walsh, after his 2-year stint with the Cardinal, would jumpstart one of the most dominant dynasties in NFL history, helping send the local 49ers to their first 3 Super Bowls, and promptly going undefeated in those 3 Super Bowls, along with refining his West Coast offense with the assistance of Hall of Famers Joe Montana, Jerry Rice, Ronnie Lott, and Steve Young. After it all, though, Walsh would seemingly want to send off his head coaching career where it started. Despite being renowned for its offensive mind, the Stanford of 1992 would dominate on the back of its defense. To illustrate this dominance, here's Stanford's Week 5 game at a top 10, thus far undefeated Notre Dame. The Irish, after going up 16-0 in the second quarter, looking to continue their dominance into the second half, would immediately get rocked, fumbling the ball away and leading to a Stanford touchdown. Next drive, just as Notre Dame re-enters Stanford territory, they'd yet again fumble the ball away, with the Cardinal eventually earning their first lead of the game. A few drives later, and you get the picture. Notre Dame, after going up 16, wouldn't score a single point for the rest of the game, and Walsh's Stanford would walk out of South Bend with a dominant 33-16 victory. To Lou Holtz, midterms were to blame. But to the rest of the nation, Stanford's defense won them a top 10 victory. The Cardinal would go on to finish 10-3, drubbing California in the process and earning a share of the Pac-10 title, albeit losing the opportunity to reach Pasadena to Washington. Walsh would end up retiring 2 years later, opting to eventually take an administrative role with the Niners, maintaining a strong connection to the college that began his career throughout. Both Stanford and Cal would end up finishing the 90s as solidly middle-of-the-road Pac-10 programs, consistently making bowls but rarely entering the top of the league. Highlights would include a California win over Iowa in the inaugural Alamo Bowl, a 38-0 Stanford shutout of the Michigan State Spartans in the Sun Bowl, and Stanford's band playing in front of O.J. Simpson's court case. It's time to finally talk about the Stanford band. Most colleges have bands, and most are full of innocuous band kids who go in, supplement the games they attend, and leave it there. They're the seasoning of college sports, a required element of the overall vibe, yet often not notable enough to highlight. Not the Stanford band. The Stanford band is unique in the sense that it's both run by the students themselves and not a band director, and it doesn't actually require musical experience. It's less a band and more a theatrical troupe. One that often gets up to some situations. This is the spotted owl, a species that was on the endangered list in Oregon due to unregulated logging, and a species the Stanford band will attempt to draw attention to during their halftime performance. How? Well, simple. By forming a chainsaw, then rearranging owl to AWOL. While being fairly inoffensive, albeit a touch preachy. The Oregon government would be infuriated by the stunt, attempting to get the band permanently exiled from the state before realizing they didn't have the constitutional right to actually do that. Stanford did, though, forcing their scripts to be checked off by the university itself before performing. That didn't stop the band from getting into more trouble, though. In 1997, to apparently call attention to the offensive caricature of Notre Dame's Fighting Irish, they'd end up doing something infinitely more offensive and reenact the Irish potato famine. And then there's their ongoing feud with BYU, which is a whole other can of worms. The Stanford band, in my eyes, is an odd product of cultural osmosis, being much more in line with Berkeley's culture of rebellion and noise than Stanford's uptight tranquility, a point driven home by Cal's chancellor in 2005. They're one of college sports, and particularly college football's oddest organizations, and one that's built to elicit some kind of strong emotion in most. In 1999, for the first time in 28 years, Stanford returned to the Rose Bowl. No, it was certainly Stanford's weakest unit to make it to Pasadena, having lost by 52 to Texas to start the season and losing to San Jose State later on. It was, in general, a really weak Pac-10, with only Oregon finishing the year ranked, but nevertheless they made it. Made all the sweeter by California not just being bad, but eventually having all 4 of their wins eventually revoked due to the scandal. Pacing the Stanford sidelines would be none other than Tyrone Willingham, the year's Pac-10 Coach of the Year, and eventual pain in both Notre Dame and Washington side for years to come. They would eventually fall to Wisconsin 9-17 in their first game of the new millennium. Both Bay schools would enter the year 2000 on completely opposite paths. Stanford on a continued revival, and California in the midst of their worst stretch of football since the 80s. Paths that converged for a moment, and the first big game to go into overtime. This game, and their 2001 matchup, would mark the end of a 21-year run of dominance for the Cardinal, achieving a 15-5-1 record in the big game, dominating their arch-rivals throughout the closing hours of the 20th century. In 2002, however, the game would finally shift back to Berkeley's favor. The largest change between the two was coaching. Cal would finally get rid of their head coach after a disastrous 1-10 season, hiring Oregon offensive coordinator Jeff Tedford in his place. To reverse California's fortunes, it'd take work, sleeping on campus, working until the early morning, spending most of the week away from home. It was work very few in the nation could pull off. Jeff Tedford did, and the results spoke for themselves in his very first year, with the Bears finishing above 500 for the first time since 1993, and ending a 7-game Stanford big game winning streak in dominant fashion. They'd achieved this turnaround with one of the best scoring offenses in the nation, an offense that was only set to get better. Now here's a fun fact. Among programs that have produced an NFL MVP, California ranks 5th, just above Syracuse and LSU, and right below Louisville and Tennessee with 4 MVP honors. You want to know why that is? Aaron Rodgers would start his first game for Cal in 2003, taking over for Reggie Robertson after a 1-3 start to the season, winning his first game against Illinois. Next up, 3rd-ranked USC. Pete Carroll's LA dynasty, complete with Reggie Bush, Matt Lienhart, and a dominant 3-0 record going into Berkeley. California would set the tone early.
Rodgers on the quarterback keeper, dives, is he in? Yes, he is! Cal takes the early lead.
What followed was perhaps one of the best games of the 2000s, with David and Goliath trading blows for 60 minutes straight, eventually going beyond regulation to first overtime, then second, and then third, before the Aaron Rodgers era had officially begun in Berkeley, and his Bears would finish the year with another winning season, a bowl berth, and another dominating win over Stanford. And then came 2004, with the Golden Bears reaching the 10-win mark for the first time since 1991, being a single score away from their first undefeated regular season since Waldorf, and achieving California's largest margin of victory in the big game ever. Aaron Rodgers would end the year as one of the nation's most efficient passers, and running back J.J. Arrington would earn consensus All-American honors. Rodgers would leave after the season to the pros, eventually becoming the first California quarterback since Joe Kapp to start in the Super Bowl, and the first to bring home a ring in the process. Cal would remain near the top of West Coast football, notching another 10-win season 2 years later. All the while, Stanford languished in coaching purgatory, dropping 5 in a row to the Bears while notching 7 straight losing seasons, all across 3 different coaches. By the end of their hunt, they ended up with a guy named Jim Harbaugh. Coming off a successful stint with the FCS San Diego Toreros, Harbaugh would rejuvenate a program left to rot after the departure of Tyrone Willingham. Much like Tedford, they'd pull off an improbable upset of a top 5 USC, this time on their own home turf. Much like Tedford, he'd snap a big game losing streak, toppling the Golden Bears 20-13. And much like Tedford, he'd make use of a talented quarterback and running back room to jumpstart the program. In 2008, in Harbaugh's 3rd year, he'd finally break above 500. On the ground, Stanford employed the nation's most prolific rusher and Heisman runner-up Toby Gerhart, and through the air, the Cardinal had the Pac-10's most accurate passer, quarterback Andrew Luck. They'd end up finishing the season 8-5, notching 3 ranked wins over Washington, Oregon, and USC, before falling to California, who'd also end up going 8-5. It was another crossroad for these rivals, and like the first one in 2000, it signaled the changing of hands, the return of Stanford dominance. In 2010, Stanford went 12-1, the most wins in a season in Cardinal history, finishing in the top 5 for the first time since 1940, complete with an offense and defense that ranked among the nation's best. Andrew Luck in a senior campaign would dominate the Pac-10, ranking 3rd in the nation passer rating behind only Kellen Moore and Cam Newton, along with notching the nation's 9th best passing yards per attempt, 5th best completion percentage, and 8th most passing touchdowns. They'd win all but 2 of their games by double digits, including a 48-14 domination of the Bears, and would fall only to Oregon in the regular season, going on to the Orange Bowl to demolish Virginia Tech. Soon after their Miami excursion, Harbaugh would follow in Bill Walsh's footsteps and move down the street to coach the 49ers, before eventually following in fielding Yost's footsteps and winning a title for Ann Arbor, being replaced by his offensive coordinator David Shaw, who had long been planned as Harbaugh's successor. The hope was sustained success, and that's exactly what they got. Their 2011 season would be nearly as dominant as their previous campaign. The next season, after a decade of wait, Stanford made their return to the Rose Bowl, earning 4 straight ranked wins on their way to Pasadena, beating Wisconsin in a rematch of their last Rose Bowl, their first win in the postseason game since Plunkett was under center. And then, they went back-to-back for the first time since, well, Plunkett was under center, where they lost by 4 to Michigan State. In this Stanford renaissance, though, where is Tedford and Cal? In 2012, after a 3-9 season, California's best head coach since Waldorf, a man who to this day holds California's record for overall wins, was fired. The brief downturn of the program, alongside the conference's lowest graduation rate among players, was presented as the reason. Like with Stanford all the way back in 1932 with Pop Warner, another of San Francisco's best head coaches would fall victim to their own school's academic prestige. In would come Sonny Dykes to replace Tedford, and in would come California's worst season ever. In 2012, Cal would lose more games in one season than they ever had, before or since, with their only win being against the FCS Portland State Vikings. Surprisingly, their offense wouldn't be terrible, led by a freshman Jared Goff, putting together an impressive opening season. There was just one small tiny problem: the defense. Giving up the second most points per game in the nation at 45.9, every single team, including Portland State, would put a minimum of 30 on the Golden Bears, with their worst loss, naturally, being at Stanford, where the Cardinals would achieve the largest blowout in the history of the big game, winning 63-13. Following rock bottom came mediocrity, not from Goff, but from the Bears as a whole. Sonny Dykes would end up with only one winning season throughout his entire tenure at Berkeley, eventually being released in 2016, all while Stanford made another Rose Bowl. In 2015, David Shaw would become the third ever Stanford coach to make the Rose Bowl 3 times, and the second to win it twice, with the help of another star running back. Ed McCaffrey, the hero of the 1990 big game, would end up having 5 sons, and one of them would end up back on the farm. You might have even heard of him. Christian McCaffrey is the poster child of a new brand of running back, an athlete with the hands and speed to average 14.3 yards a reception, and the strength and awareness to average 6 rushing yards a carry. In each of the 2 years he spent as a starter, he'd be among the top 10 in all-purpose yards, a shining resume that'd make him the 8th overall pick in the 2017 draft, ending up with the Carolina Panthers before eventually finding his way back to the Bay in 2022. Throughout this stretch, Stanford would extend their winning streak over the hopeless Golden Bears to 9, the most ever wins in a row between these two programs. It's a streak that had finally ended 2019, with Stanford finally regressing after a decade of blinding success, just in time for a globe-altering pandemic. In the midst of an odd, shortened COVID season, Cal and Stanford would have themselves yet another miraculous finish to close a game. Late in the game, Stanford leads 24-18, yet with the Bears on the verge of scoring, threatening to send the big game into overtime for the second time in history. Sure enough, they'd reached the end zone, and...
Blocked! Stanford has it! Is that the play that sends the Axe back to the South Bay?
How do you end an era? How do you end a status quo that, outside of a couple expansions in the 70s and 2010s, has stayed largely the same since 1964? How do you end the days of LA dynasties, of absurd big game closers, of Washington's rise and fall, of Oregon's newly found riches? Well, There was only one way it could have ended. For the third time in history, West Coast football died. It began with the primary driver of the last collapse, Los Angeles. In 2022, it was announced that UCLA and USC would jump ship to the Big Ten, ending more than 100 years of cooperation between the Western and Midwestern conferences. The reason seemed fairly simple. For LA, it meant more money from the Big Ten's lucrative media deal, and for the Big Ten, it meant keeping up with the SEC and their recent additions of Texas and Oklahoma. LA's departure would kick off a year of panic as the Pac-12's media deal began to expire, with the new one needing to be hashed out. The 10 programs left wanted $50 million a year. The best ESPN could do was 30. As talks broke down, Colorado would take it upon themselves to jump back to the Big 12, and in response to now Pac-9 got a media deal done. $20 million a year with Apple TV. Less than half of what the member schools wanted and $10 million less than what ESPN offered. Oregon and Washington left for the Big Ten shortly after, with Utah and the Arizona schools following Colorado to the Big 12. And soon, there were only 4. San Francisco would be among the last to jump ship, either due to loyalty or lack of options, but would jump ship regardless, to the now ironically named Atlantic Coast Conference, in a cruel repeat of the old PCC's collapse. The only 2 programs left were the Pac-12's smallest brands, Oregon and Washington State. Their fates still undecided, in a husk of a once proud league. 2023 would end up being the last season Cal and Stanford would play in an exclusively Western Conference for the foreseeable future. It'd also be the first season since 2011 without David Shaw, being let go the previous year after 4 straight losing seasons. The Cardinal would end up sinking further without him, going 3-9, losing to the FCS team they poached their new head coach from, and leaving the Pac-12's last big game with a loss. Mostly due to San Francisco's new star running back Jaden Ott. From the ambitions of Garrett Cochran to the dominance of Andy Smith, from the experiments of Pop Warner to the experiments of Bill Walsh, from an axe to a trombone, from Moscow, Idaho to Moscow, Russia, from Ernie Nevers to Joe Kapp, from Jim Plunkett to Andrew Luck, from 2 to 8 to 10 to 12, and finally back to 2. The story of the West Coast first rivalry is a story of West Coast football itself, with these schools' primordial hatred coloring the history of this region and its people. Its legacy of innovation, wonders, stars, personalities, champions, and above all, resilience. San Francisco and its programs have witnessed Western football's death twice before, and now they stand at the precipice of another. The cycle turns once more. If there's anything to be gathered from all of this history, it's that Western football will be reborn, in a new form with new dynasties, new stars, and new champions. In whatever form West Coast football takes next, 3 things will remain a constant. Cal and Stanford will always play, their axe will forever trade hands, and the people of San Francisco will argue whether or not Dwight Gardner was down forevermore.